So as I keep saying, I'm using this curriculum on Tuesday mornings. I'm usually using this curriculum on Wednesday nights, and I've been doing a subset of it with our older teens on Sunday mornings. So I've really been delving into these issues, but the teens have a lot of questions about faith and, what if I don't believe and all of these things. Debbie Button, where are you? You also are sleepless. You're here.
I'm here. I just got back from pickleball.
Okay, there you go.
Sorry,
I know you're not in Florida. I know you're
no,
here.
I'm not, and it's not a bathing suit. It's
When that first winter of COVID, we went down to Florida for 5 weeks. And so when we'd Zoom, Shabbat services were all by Zoom. And when we would Zoom, I would be in a sleeveless dress, sitting on a white leather couch, looking like I had some color. And people were like, where are you? There's nothing about this picture that looks like you're at home. And I'm like, I'm sorry. So I thought, but
can't
it's still,
hide it.
so, so, all right. So, Dave. So today we've been looking at a lot about the Torah. We have brought in some other sources, but we've been looking at really Abraham as sort of the archetype for the various complexities of faith. There's somebody who's, totally obedient, or somebody who questions, or a combination of both. So, we looked at those sources. We're going to look at some very different sources today. None of them are from the Torah. And we're actually not going to look at Abraham, Joshua, Heschel, but I keep thinking about a joke that Rabbi Frankel used to tell. So Abraham Joshua Heschel was a 20th century Jewish philosopher, rabbi, mystic, and one of his most well-known books was God in Search of Man. So, which is an interesting title, right? It's not human beings searching for God, it's God searching for people. And actually, in reading the Torah, one could really make the case that God is seeking out human beings to form a relationship with. So Rabbi Frankel used to like to tell this joke. Heschel's first book was God in Search of Man. His second book was Man in Search of God. And his third book was Peekaboo. So, you can only really tell that joke to a very few number of people, frankly, but I got it. I thought it was funny. But to a certain extent, I thought about that joke today because the first source we're going to look at, one could say the theme of it is peekaboo. So the first source that we're going to look at is a source from Song of Songs, Shira Shirim. Shira Shirim, Song of Songs, is a book in the Bible. It is attributed to King Solomon, though no scholar thinks that King Solomon wrote this. But it's got nice alliteration. Shira Shirim Asher Shlomo, right? Shira Shirim attributed to Shlomo has a very nice ring in Hebrew. It is basically at its face love poetry. It is the poetry, when you read it and you're going to look at it, the easiest and most simple way to read it is this is love poetry between a man and a woman. Scholars think, so how did it get into the Bible? Scholars think that one possibility is that it was very popular, well-known folk literature that people knew, so why not stick it in? But the rabbis take this love poetry and say it's actually an allegory. It's actually an allegory, not of a love story between a man and a woman, or a woman and a man, because sometimes the voice of the poetry is from the point of view of a man, sometimes it's from the point of view of a woman, but it's actually an allegory of a love story between God and the children of Israel. Or my favorite commentary from the Art Scroll Siddur is when the lover says to the woman, your breasts are like the mountains of whatever, they're referring to Moses and Aaron. So take it as you may. We read Shir HaShirim, I mean, we don't at Am Yisrael, but traditionally Shir HaShirim is read during Pesach time. So if you look at it as an allegory, as a love story, then the allegory, we see why Pesach would be an allegory of a love story, because it is In many ways, Pesach is the story, obviously it's the story of redemption from Israel, but it's the story of our covenantal relationship with God. So we're going to look at just a short section from Shir Shirim. When you see it, you're going to be like, oh, this is an interesting allegory. It seems pretty clear this is just a love story. But when I'm reading it to you, try to think about, if you were to read this as an allegory between God and Israel, what is it that it's actually saying? So this is from chapter 5. I was asleep, but my heart was wakeful. Hark, my beloved knocks. Let me in, my own, my darling, my faultless dove, for my head is drenched with dew, my locks with damp of night. I had taken off my robe. So, if you're reading this as love poetry, it's a little racy, right? The lovers in bed, naked. What to do? Was I to don it again? I had bathed my feet. Was I to soil them again? My beloved took his hand off the latch, and my heart was stirred for him. I rose to let in my beloved. Doesn't say she put a robe on. I rose to let in my beloved. My hands dripped myrrh, my fingers flowing myrrh upon the handles of the bolt. I opened the door for my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone. I was faint because of what he said. I sought, but found him not. I called, but he did not answer. So if we are looking at this as more of an allegory, and not just a love story between two lovers, what is going on? So what do you think is going on? Marcia?
Okay, so the beloved has been perhaps outside waiting. The night has gotten damp. His hair is damp. He knocks at the door of his lover and hears, and the lover hears him say these things. Well, should I get up? I'm all in bed. Who could it be? Okay. Decides to get up. I'm really ready to let this lover in, but he's gone. And stirred, she went to look for him.
Right.
But did not find him. It's a beautiful longing. I mean, that's a marvelous thing that's picked up, the longing for God, the longing to connect.
That's right. That's the part of the allegory about this, right? Is that's why I said peekaboo, right? Like, he's there, he's ready, she's not ready. But then she goes to find him and he's gone. So on some level, the poignancy is that of what would happen if you finally open your door to your lover and you're too late.
You're right.
Right? Will he come back again? Did I, send him away one too many times and now he's over me? I mean, if you read it just as a romance, it has a lot of poignancy of what can happen, right? This reminds me of another thing Rabbi Frankel used to say, the plot of every Yiddish play. He wants and she doesn't want, she wants and he doesn't want, and when they both want, the play is over. Which is probably true of a lot of I happen to like to read romance novels, and so there's a little bit of truth to that probably in every romance novel. But this is a very poignant description, right? Like, and also, she's still a woman. You have to ask a lot of questions about how the heck this ended up in the Bible. This is the assumption. This is an unmarried man and an unmarried woman. What the heck is he doing to her door in the middle of the night? Any good girl would never open the door. Lets us know that she's not clothed, doesn't tell us that she quickly threw on her robe. So it's, you could see why people, I mean, given the limits of entertainment, this was probably.
Actually, you kind of have to wonder why she even asked, should I or should I not don my robe?
Right,
That question right there, you're like, who are you and what are you thinking?
Right.
Who's at the door?
Right. You're right.
She doesn't know who's there.
Really fascinating that this ends up in the Bible. Because
Our
Maybe it's teaching a
hands,
different lesson,
too.
Rabbi.
Well, that's what the rabbis try to say, right? This isn't about, you don't confuse that this is a man and a woman, right? This is Israel, right? This Israel is the one. In any time you have a metaphor of God and the people Israel, God is the groom and Israel is the bride. So Israel's the woman, right? And God comes looking for her, which is also just really interesting, right? I mean, in the end, she's looking for God, but it's sort of what I said about Heschel, like this description of God comes looking for her, or God comes looking for the children of Israel. The children of Israel don't open the door. Then when they finally open the door, God's not there. And then they go searching and they can't find God. So what kind of theology is this? What is this trying to say? Or maybe what is it trying to say about any kind of potential relationship with God?
Don't wait.
Well, first of all, right, don't wait.
But
Don't
on the other
wait.
hand, she doesn't know who's at the door.
Right,
So she's
Don't-
putting on a robe
right.
or
So
hesitating.
don't wait. What else?
Well, it makes it seem as if maybe God left for the reason that there was something that the bride or the female did not do that pleased God right away, whether it was immediately say something or do something. And so this is not a lover who's going to wait and accept whatever the female gives to the male. This male has an agenda.
Right. I came and you didn't answer.
Goodbye.
I'm not here anymore. I'm going to leave. So
But how does she know that it's God at the door?
But how does she know? Well, how does she know that it's God at the door?
Yeah.
And
Barb?
why does she?
Maybe this uncertainty, he loves me not, is a universal human condition.
Right. He loves me not. So think about what that means for a relationship with God. Right? God loves me not. God's sometimes at the door and I can hear God knocking, and sometimes I go out searching and I can't find God at all.
Well, it could be the lacking of faith in the lover, in the
Could be lacking
female
of
part of it.
Right.
That, God is there, but you might not always see him. You might not always hear him. You
Right.
have to be attuned to those sounds.
Right. You have to be I like that. You have to be right. If you fall asleep, you're not going to hear the knock. Right. Like you have to be. So this metaphor, right, is actually a very deep metaphor. And it's saying, if the rabbis are right, that this was put into the Bible, not because it was just popular love poetry and somebody wanted to stick it in, but because actually, if you read it in a different way and on a different level, it says a lot about what it can be like to try to be in a relationship with God, which is sometimes God's right there and you can hear the knock on the door. And sometimes you search and search and search and you can't find. And sometimes God comes to search for you and you're not ready, right? You're not ready to open the door. God might be there, but you're not there. And so it's like that. That's why I said peekaboo. Like you're there somehow, even if if as the rabbis believe that God, the thing about rabbinic Judaism is it's very different than biblical Judaism. And the reason that rabbinic Judaism is so different than biblical Judaism is they were not living in a world of miracles. They were not living in a world of prophecy. They were not living in a world where people heard God's voice and then somebody carried that message and they felt this presence. They lived in a world that was like our world, right? Filled with evil, filled with doubt, filled with what they believed is the Torah and these teachings of a gift from God. But there was no longer, if there ever really was, but they believed there was no longer this direct voice of God. As a matter of fact, they were kind of wary of a direct voice of God because because if you thought you heard a direct voice of God, it could lead you astray. And there's a really powerful and beautiful story in the Talmud about God gave us the Torah. It's up to us to decide what the Torah means and to interpret it. And we don't want voices from heaven, because that will just derail us, right? We have to have a system. You have a voice from heaven, law can change every time the voice comes down. It's not a stable way of living. We want a system, we want a legal system. But this idea that you could believe in God, but God could feel very, very distant. And that you have a God that comes searching from you. And sometimes God feels that human beings are very distant. One of the stories in the Torah that I love is when the children of Israel are getting ready to receive the 10 Commandments. God gives Moses all of these instructions. Make sure they wash, make sure they ritually prepare, but make sure you set bounds up around the mountain, because when I come down, the children of Israel are going to run towards the mountain and it's not safe, right? You can't come into that kind of, think, Raiders of the Lost Ark. You can't come into contact with God or the holy or the divine. A human being can't withstand it. And so God descends on Mount Sinai and begins to speak to the children of Israel, and they run away. So it's interesting, right? God thinks they're going to want to run towards me, and they're afraid and they run away. And you'd think God would know, right? You'd think God would know what people are going to do. God is constantly surprised in the Torah about what people are going to do or not going to do. For somebody, for a being that's described as omniscient, there's a lot God doesn't know or understand about human beings. And so this story, reading the story this way, sort of reflects this idea that God is sort of there and not there. And the rabbis actually developed this concept because, of course, they lived in a world where they did not have autonomy, where Israel not only was defeated by the Romans, but the Jewish population was either exiled or began to leave in droves because it was a very unpleasant place to live. It wasn't safe on the roads. Taxation was high. It wasn't safe. It wasn't a safe place to live. Roman soldiers, you didn't really want to be living in proximity to Roman soldiers. There were robbers, all kinds of things. So the rabbis were looking at this world that was shifting from primarily being based in Israel to primarily being based outside of Israel. And they began to develop this theology that God traveled with the children of Israel, that God went into exile with the children of Israel, and that sometimes God's presence, when you ask, why does God do this? Why does this, happen? Why did this happen to me? That God's presence is hidden from human beings. And that sometimes God chooses to hide God's presence, and there's no answers to these questions. I mean, the same kind of questions that we ask, they asked, and they developed a theology that said, sometimes you can never really know. So when they look at it that way, it's this, sometimes the timing's just wrong, right? Just as like in human relationships. Debbie, do you want to say something? Oh, I wasn't sure if I said your hand. Just like sometimes in human relationships, right? You meet somebody at the wrong time, you're not ready. Maybe you meet them later on and you take a second look, and things turn out differently. But in any case, that's what this piece is about. And so we're going to look at a few other pieces that base themselves on what we've just read in Shira Shirim about this massive game of peekaboo. So the next teaching is from the Zohar. The Zohar is a mystical work. It's actually, the rabbis say that it was attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, which would have made it like 2nd century of the Common Era, but it's actually later than that. And again, like probably wasn't, scholars do not think it was written by him. But this book is the foundation of Jewish mysticism. It's very hard to understand. It's very hard to understand. But the Zohar and mystical Judaism tries to expand people's relationship or experience with God through, well, let's just say altered state of mind. Let's just say that. They don't really talk about, doing drugs, but doing things like staying up all night, praying and not sleeping, or, certain forms of meditation or chanting. so that, to try to lift yourself up out of sort of the
Bless you.
your everyday, sort of experience, to try to sensitize yourself. And so let's look what they say, how they refer to Song of Songs. So Rabbi Chia Rabbah went to the masters of the Mishnah to learn from them. He went to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and saw a curtain of fire that divided the house. I'll tell you an interesting story that we know of, probably one of the most famous stories of Shimon Bar Yochai is he was one of the disciples of Rabbi Akiva. He had to flee during the Roman revolt, and he lived with his son in a cave for 3 years. And when he finally, it's safe to come out of the cave, he comes out of the cave and he sees people Jews doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. And his gaze is so intense that he's able to burn them up. And God says to him, go back to the cave. Go back to the cave, or you're not really fit to live in this world, which is an interesting story in that he's considered one of the great rabbis, but maybe not somebody who should be a pastor and live amongst people. So there's a curtain of fire in his very house, and Rabbi Shimon and his students were on the inside of the curtain. So let's just think about that. I mean, this isn't really about God, but think about what it would mean to have the great rabbinic figure and all his great disciples on one side of a curtain of fire, and everybody else, talk about like an ivory tower. This might be amazing study and scholarship for the sake of heaven, but it's not doing, anything for, the people on the other side of the fiery curtain. So Rabbi Chia is on the other side of the curtain, and he's listening to this Torah discussion. And he heard the voice of one of the students of Rabbi Shimon who said, "Make haste, my beloved, and be you like a gazelle or a young hart." Right? So this is a quote from Shir HaShirim, the lover saying, "Be like a gazelle." So again, if you were just reading sort of the simple meaning of this as religious of love poetry, come quickly to me, right? You're a gazelle, run quickly, come, I'm going to call you, and you should come as fast as you can, like a gazelle runs quickly. And then he says, because he again reads this as, not a love story between two human beings, but a love story between God and Israel. All the longings that Israel had for the blessed Holy One were, as Rabbi Shimon said, the desire of Israel is that the blessed Holy One should not distance, but rather run like a gazelle or a young deer. So that's how, when we call on God, we want God to come quickly. Right? We call on God. We want you to think about the gazelle, like leaping, over, like we call and we want God to run to us. Rabbi Shimon said, what is the reason there is no animal in the world who does as the gazelle or young deer when it flees? We're going to come back to this last paragraph, so I just want to finish it. When it flees, goes a measure and turns its head to the place whence it left. It always turns its head backwards. So did Israel say, Master of the universe, if we cause that you ascend from us, let it be your desire that you shall flee like a gazelle or young deer who flees and turns its head to the place that it left, meaning the place it was before from where it had fled. So when we call to God, we want God to run to us like a gazelle. But what are they claiming? I have no idea if this is biologically true. But what are they saying that gazelles and deer do when they run away?
Look
They
back.
turn their head back to see where they came from.
Right. They stop and they turn around.
And they do.
Do they? Is that true? Okay.
In Africa, they do.
Okay,
But that's
so-
generally, I thought, because they can sense that danger is on their way. And that is why they are generally running like a gazelle. And
Right.
what they do, not terribly unlike a person who's being chased. You run away from it, but you kind of turn your head back to see, is that chasing animal still after me? But if you see them running through the wild, lands of Africa, what they do is they run very quickly, but they do turn their head back all of the time to look and see if
Wow.
they're still being followed.
So what's the metaphor here? Not that they're in danger, right? If it's God running away like a gazelle, but what's the metaphor?
Is God supposed to be running away or toward?
God is running away in this case,
Okay.
right? Like we pray and we want God to run towards us as quickly as a gazelle would run. But the text is saying, but sometimes we cause you to run away, right? Not because you're scared of us, but we drive you away, right? We
Mhm.
drive you away.
But we want God to keep looking back for us. We don't
To have
want
that
him to
connection.
take us out of his view.
Right. So we want you to be like a gazelle, right? Even when you're running from us, even or moving away from us,
Right.
they say God is like a gazelle who's always looking back at us. So that's also a fascinating, right? Like God, you may feel that God is moving away or that God is distant, but their statement of faith is even in that distance, God is still turning to look back at us, unlike other animals who maybe run. And they're, of course, tying this into Shir Hashirim because Shir Hashirim uses the image of the gazelle over and over as the lover. So why a gazelle, right? Why is the lover a gazelle? A lover could be a lion. A lover could be, I don't know, there's other animals that you might, I don't know, a horse. I don't know. There are other, I mean, they probably didn't have horses, but I don't know, there could be another animal. But they say, no, no, no. It's very specifically a gazelle because sometimes when we call, God runs to us quickly. But even when God is moving away from us, God never totally turns God's face towards us. So this is the Zohar's incredible sort of statement of faith, right? The statement of faith that
Maybe
even in the
making sure that people are still following.
right. Well, that too. It doesn't do a lot of good if you're like running away. I made it, and
they're like,
there's
oh,
everybody
God.
else. Right, maybe peekaboo is the wrong, maybe hide and seek, right? Like if you're counting and everybody's like left the game and then you go to look and nobody's there. But it is like a game of peekaboo or maybe more like a game of hide and seek, right? Sometimes I'm seeking and you're hiding, sometimes God's seeking and we're hiding. But the Zohar says, no, the great statement of faith is that even, God is always, even if God is very distant, God is turning God's head to check. Okay, so let's look at another source. So now we're going like way to modern Hebrew poetry. So Zelda, I think we looked at something from Zelda already. Zelda I mean, she's deceased now. Zelda was she was like before Madonna, there was Zelda, a one-word name, Hebrew poet, wrote really like in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She was a very interesting woman because she was Orthodox. So she was not a labor Zionist. She was not a pioneer. She was not a socialist. She didn't live on a kibbutz. She lived in Jerusalem. She actually was a school teacher. And if you've ever read Amos Oz's book, Tales of Love and Darkness, he talks about her because she was one of his teachers. And when he was a little boy, he had a crush on her. So he talks about his memories of his teacher Zelda and one of his earliest crushes. But she was unusual in that there weren't, first of all, there were not a lot of women poets in Israel at that point, or maybe there were, but we never heard of them. Who knows? That's always a possibility that there were plenty. They just remained unpublished. But the fact that she was Orthodox and that she was married and that she remained part of the Orthodox world, probably her most famous poem that some of you might heard of, I can't think of the exact name, but a person's name. You're known by your birth and your death, and it's sometimes it's read at funerals. Anyways, never mind if you're not familiar with it.
It's not the one that's in the prayer book about.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
About
Each
the names.
There is his name and all of the names that are given to you by your parents and the names that are given to you by your deeds. And so
by
it is
a person you're married, and then when you're free to.
Right. That's by the Elenu, and that's another poet, another female poet. I like that one too. That is about names, but I think Zelda's in somewhere else. Yeah, I love that poem actually. Okay. There are those who think that if a person is religious, then their faith, as it were, sits in a box. They do not understand that every single day the believer must renew their faith. So what do we assume, not we, some of us maybe, about religious people? According to Zelda,
Their faith is rock solid.
right? Their faith is rock solid, right? If they're people of faith, their faith is rock solid. And she says something I think really powerful, which is it's not, right? What is it? What is it? What does a person of faith have to do?
They have to renew it every day.
Right. So
But that reminds me, actually, when my parents were alive and I was first married. They're married 72 years, and my mother and I was married very young, and my mother said to me even back then, one thing I'm going to tell you about marriage, you have to work at it every day. The
Yeah.
fact that you're married isn't enough to be married. You have to work at it. And then, and of course, at 20, I didn't understand what she meant, but that's a lot like your religion and your faith. You can't just put it in a box and walk away and assume that it will stay fresh and current for you.
my grandmother used to say, in a marriage, everybody gives 75%, 75%. And I would say to her, but that doesn't add up. And she's like, uh-huh. Like, yep, that's the point. And actually, if any of you heard, I listened to this really, I thought, great interview of Michelle Obama, who talks about marriage and talks about parenting and talks about politics, because of her new book. You probably could Google it. I think it was through NPR. It was actually terrific. But she said what she feels that one of the big mistakes is that nobody really tells young people, especially today, the amount of work it takes to be married. Like they think, and I see this with young couples, right? It's all about the wedding, right? Like they think that's very stressful, planning that wedding. And in our tradition, the idea of our relationship with God is that it's a covenantal relationship. And so while it's not exactly like a marriage, because it's not really, though maybe it's more like an ancient marriage when the partnership wasn't equal, but very often in other places too, when the prophets talk about Israel in the wilderness, they talk about Israel as a young bride and God is the groom. I mean, the marriage metaphor isn't, Shira Shirim isn't actually a marriage metaphor, but there is a marriage metaphor very often in our tradition when we talk about God and Israel, because it's a covenant, and probably the closest covenantal relationship that we've experienced as human beings is that if we've been married, which on some level, especially in ancient times, was, and even now, a ketubah, right? It's contractual. It's a contractual relationship, but living with somebody day in and day out and working at that day in and day out, right? If you just assume like everything, they talk about this a lot when people have young children, because they get very, very caught up, as we do, in the raising of young children and don't always think about the state of their marriage. And that you can't just leave it in a box, right? You can't just leave it in a box, because there are people that, when their kids go off to college, look at each other and say, like, what, like, do I even know you anymore? And all kinds of other things. So yeah, it's this idea that she says, like, people assume that faith is something that if you have it, you have it, and it's just, you can rely on it, right? Like, put it in your little treasured box and you stick it over here and you own this treasure and it's yours. And then her saying, no, it's actually not the case. You have to work at it every single day. And I find that very compelling. I think I shared this early on in the class, but I was so struck many years ago when Mother Teresa died and they published her diaries and her unbelievable struggle with faith. And for a lot of people, particularly a lot of Catholics, they were shocked. They were really shocked. And I was not shocked, because I'm Jewish, so I wasn't shocked even in the least little bit. But I felt like, how could you see what she saw? How could you see the depths of that human suffering and degradation every day of your life and not have questions of faith? Like, unless you're like a totally, I don't know, a psychopath, how could you see what she saw and not have questions? And of course she did. And I found that very comforting. Like I found that very comforting because I felt like it made her this woman who did, such good in the world and so selfless, but still was a human being who still reacted to human suffering, and saw that pain and didn't. So to me, that was very powerful. I actually gave a holiday sermon about it because I do feel like, I was talking with the teenagers about this. Like, I don't know for sure, but I assume that the teenagers, especially the teenagers, have certain assumptions about my faith. I'm a rabbi, so I must, have this all figured out, and I have all the answers, and I have no doubts. And I try to reassure them that, if they have these, they're not alone, that even their rabbi, I don't know if that's comforting to them. Maybe it's not comforting. They were like, oh, great, but yes, Marcia.
This is something you've always done. And I have to tell you that Jim found great comfort in it and just immediately was drawn, because I think his assumption had been like, oh, rabbis are, just got it all, as you said, figured out. And the fact that you've always shared your humanity with us has been very powerful. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's
Thank you.
important, I
Thank you.
think.
I'm married to somebody who, Dan is, I don't know how to describe this. His faith in God is pretty like rock steady. Like he does not have the kind of doubts that I have. So it's generated a lot of interesting conversations in our marriage over the years. But it's he's and I admire, it's not that he doesn't have his doubts and his moments. It's not in a box. But it's interesting to, be in a relationship with somebody that
Different.
doesn't see things necessarily. We don't necessarily see things the same way. Danny Frankel.
Well, I was just going to say that as far as an Orthodox person, or really any Jew who's at all observant, first thing you do when you wake up in the morning is you say Modani.
Right.
And immediately you've renewed your faith.
Right.
And then you say the morning blessings. Thank you, God, for making me a free person and for clothing the naked and so on and so forth. So if you follow an observant lifestyle, it's inherent in it that your faith will be renewed, because if you pay attention to the prayers that you're saying,
Right, which is an if.
right, which we don't do, but
No, but even as a religious person, you could get up in the morning and do it by rote.
of
But
course.
the idea that actually the first thing you say in the morning is you thank God for restoring your soul. When you get up to go to the bathroom, you thank God for, that your body works. And then there's a whole list of prayers about, being thankful. So, and we know a lot about the idea of gratitude, right? Of just being appreciative and thinking about what you have and not taking it for granted and all of that. But there are prayers that are built into the liturgy that we ask for God to restore our faith. We ask, one of my favorite prayers is when we, return the Torah and we say, Hashivenu Adonai Alecha v'nashuva, right? Return us to you and we will return. And I find that so powerful. Like to me, that really sort of means like, I can only get there part way, right? Return us to you and we will return. Like it reminds me of the end of The Chosen, right? Which is a quote from the Talmud, like come as far as you can, the dad says, and I'll come the rest of the way. That's what it sort of reminds me of. Like I want to be, like a gazelle or whatever running towards you, but I can only get so far as a human being, as a person of my nature or makeup or situationally what's happening. And so to even ask God for the ability, to renew my faith or to help me return, I think is it's sort of baked into the system. Was somebody else, Barb? But you got on mute though.
All of your selections illustrate the point that even if God flees man, or if man avoids God, there's always a relationship that subsists there beyond the individual actions of each party. The relationship endures.
It's like that poem, I believe in the sun even when it's not shining,
Mhm.
right? Like I can't, if we're all people of faith, that one day we're going to see the sun again, those of us in Chicago, right? That I believe in love even when I can't feel it. Like there are things that we believe in even if we're not experiencing it at the moment. And so that's what these are saying as well. All right, let's look. I think we have two more. So Martin Buber was a peer, basically, of Heschel's, 20th century philosopher. And he wrote a collection of Hasidic tales. So these Hasidic tales existed. Buber didn't write them, he just collected them. And this is about the Rabbi of Katsk, which was a Hasidic rabbi in the town of Katsk. So a Chassid came to the Rabbi of Katsk. Rabbi, he complained, I keep brooding and brooding and don't seem to be able to stop. What do you brood about? Asked the rabbi. I keep brooding about whether there is really a judgment and a judge, right? So is there really a God that's judging us, and are we really going to get a judgment? What does it matter to you? The rabbi says to him, Rabbi, if there is no judgment and no judge, then what does all creation mean? What does that matter to you? Rabbi, if there's no judgment and judge, then what do the words of the Torah mean? What does that matter to you? Rabbi, what does it matter to me? What does the rabbi think? What else could matter to me? Well, if it matters to you as much as all that, said the Rabbi of Katsk, then you are a good Jew after all, and it is quite all right for a good Jew to brood. Nothing can go wrong with him. So, these Hasidic tales are usually very nice and simple, and so, this guy, like, is there what does it all mean, right? Is there really a God? Is there really going to be a judgment? Is there really, does the Torah really mean anything? Like, what does this all mean? And what does the rabbi say to him? Does he give him any answers? Right, there's no answer. But as long as you brood about these things, then you're clearly a good Jew, right? To think, to be, maybe even to say, to be agonized, to think about what's the meaning of life and what does it all mean and what's the meaning of Torah and, why should we do any of it? I think it was Elie Wiesel said, right, that the opposite of, can't remember exactly how I said that, but the opposite of belief is not belief. The opposite of belief is indifference, right? As long as you still care enough to ask, then that means, according to this Hasidic tale, enter Elie Wiesel, it means something. If you don't even care enough to ask and even think about any of these things in any way whatsoever, then, you're not a, yes, Debbie?
So basically, if you want it, it's yours to have.
Right. Right. And even if you don't know the answers, even if you never come up with the answer of what does any of this really mean, as long as you keep asking, you're engaged, as long as you're sort of, it's like the search, right? I mean, it's this metaphor of, I'm still going to go out and search for you, even though, you're no longer at the door. As long as I'm still, according to this, right? As long as you're still thinking about it and you're engaged in it, and which is a really, I will say the thing about Hasidism is sometimes it was very often anti-intellectual, and sometimes there are stories that I don't particularly like that much, but they tried to simplify things to a certain extent, right? It's not that, it's not like, well, go to the yeshiva, study, become an intellectual, devote your life to Torah. It's like just even asking, what does this mean? Like, is dayenu, right? Even that is just enough. And it changes, it really turns on its head the idea of what does it mean to be a good Jew, right? Because they could have said, just follow the laws. Don't concern yourself with all these questions. They're not going to lead you anywhere. Like, don't think about these questions. Just follow the laws of the Torah. That's what it means to be a good Jew, and stop driving yourself crazy. But that's not what he says, right? That's not the answer. The answer is a good Jew is a questioning Jew, a struggling Jew, someone who doesn't have all the answers, but stays engaged in the game, as opposed to just walking away, of which we all know, people that do that. Like, we know people that do that. All right, we have one. Yes, Danny.
Well, I personally have
Yeah.
never really struggled with the question of faith, whether there's God or not. I mean, and I'm not saying it's because I take it as a given that God exists. I have no idea, but I don't really ever treat it like it's a huge, important question. So, and yet, as you know, I attend synagogue regularly. I was educated and my children are educated and so forth. So am I a good Jew?
You go to synagogue. Yeah, I mean, this isn't saying that people, right, that I think what this text is saying, I'm gonna say, yes, you're a good Jew. I think what this text is saying is, even if obviously there are many ways to be a good Jew, and the definition of that is, but I feel like this is a text for people that really are struggling with their faith and not writing them out. Not only not writing them out, but elevating them as part of the conversation. And, and that's probably, that's important, right? It's important not just to say, and I don't see this so much with adults, right? But with teens who begin to ask these questions because it's different from the way they were raised or what they were told or whatever, and start to ask these questions and then assume like I'm not part of this tradition anymore. Listen, where the rubber meets the road is with our young people that are becoming anti-Zionists. There's a lot of talk now, especially among the rabbis, about, do we really want to write these kids out? Like, what if they want to come to our come to our synagogues, be part of our communities, but like, dare we, we write them off at our own peril? They're asking questions that are really difficult and painful for my generation and their parents' generation. Really painful, really hard. And it's tempting to say to them, you're beyond the pale. But you sort of do that at your own peril, right? Like, these are kids that actually care about Judaism. They just have a different way of looking at Israel. And frankly, with this new Israeli government, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah.
It is going to be really hard. So what I love about this text, and it'd be interesting to apply it, it's easy for us to apply to people that question about the Torah or question about God, because we all question those things. So it's an easy text to apply to that. Try applying it, to kids that are asking these questions about Israel, and all of a sudden you understand that in its time, this text was probably very jarring. Right? Like, but how do you try to keep everybody, in the fold? All right, we've got one last text. So this is Nachmanides. He is known as Ramban, not his other Rambam. So Nachmanides was also a rabbi of the Spanish school of Jewry, and was very well known, is very well known, not as well as Maimonides, but wrote an entire commentary on the Torah. And this is what he has to say about faith. The third subject discernible in Solomon's general comments on the vanities of this world. So he's actually not referring to Shir Hashirim, he's referring to Kohelet, which is also attributed to King Solomon. They say he wrote Shir Hashirim, the love poetry, when he was young, and Kohelet in his more jaded view of humans and human nature when he was old. Remember, Kohelet, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So what does that mean, right? His general comment on the vanities of this world that he mentioned is the difficult problem that constitutes both the root of rebellion and the source of faith. It is a problem that has baffled the former and the latter of all nations, ethnic groups. It is the enigma of the righteous man who fares badly and the wicked man who fares well. So what's the crisis of faith for all people in all times not just for Jews, but for everybody, wherever you're from, for all time, is why do the righteous suffer and evil people flourish? And that, he says, is really the greatest challenge to faith. Now, I think this last text is kind of glommed on and should have been in a different unit from this unit that was all, I mean, I think the connection was still King Solomon. So I think this text was sort of glommed on to the rest of this. But, you know, the two great challenges, I would say then, if I'm going to try to make sense of why this text was here, is not only do we struggle because sometimes God feels very distant, sometimes God feels unapproachable, sometimes God feels like God is fleeing, maybe to look back and maybe not. We don't hear the knock, we hear the knock, God is gone. But it's not just God's distance, it's what we see in the world. And what we see in the world is human suffering. And what we see in the world is evil people that I sometimes wonder if that was our hardest struggle for those of us that hated Trump so much, was how could somebody who's so evil be so successful? How could somebody who was so evil, how could other people not see this? And, you know, it wasn't just, we hated his politics, though we did. You know, it's, well, who said it was the cruelty that was the point? You know, I think that was sort of the biggest struggle, is how could somebody who's so overtly cruel be so successful in a democracy? So, you know, so they're adding this other really element of difficulty in faith. All right, what do you think? Anything else?
You're good.
That's the tough part.
Right.
That's not necessarily a good place to end, because
Right.
all of this, and
No,
then
we could
throw
add a
in
few
the-
more to
Right.
Mr. Trump.
Right.
Oh my God, what's going on?
Yeah.
But it's the ultimate test. If you
Right.
can maintain your faith in the face of what you see in the world,
Right.
then it's strong, it's powerful, but it's not in a box.
Right.
No.
It's not
It's
in a
going to
box.
always be challenged.
Right. It's not in
Yeah.
a box. You
Yeah.
got to give yourself a talking to every day.
Oh, yes.
And life is a really long journey. And quote, life for God is even a bigger journey
Right,
than we
right.
see. We only see a very small part of it. So what we see about Trump or about Hitler or some evil, why bad things happen to good people or good things happen to bad people, may not be the end of
Right.
the story. We just don't know that
You
yet.
just don't know yet.
No.
Listen, if you know, if history goes like this, it seems like we're in a, you know, we're in a dip. You know, I don't think it'll last forever. I agree. I hope not. I have a little more faith in American democracy after the midterms, and I'm a little bit now. I'm back to worrying about Israel's democracy.
Yeah.
I think for very, very, very good reason.
Yep.
But we, you know, somebody said to me, like, but right-wing governments are being elected all over this world, and democracies, you know, being threatened in many, many places. And it's like, you're absolutely right. Doesn't make me feel better.
Yeah.
No,
You're
but it's happened
absolutely
before in history. You have to really get a big grip of history.
right.
Other times, worse plagues, worse
Right.
despots, and that doesn't necessarily make
Right.
us feel good for our
Right.
time,
No.
Right.
but
I
it
just,
may
you
not be
know,
the worst.
right.
May not be the worst of times.
Well, I never really bought the, like, you know, we're in Germany in the 30s. I never really bought that. I think the Republican Party would like to jettison us back to the 50s with a much less civil society than I assume that existed in the 50s. You know, but I don't really know. You know, but I don't really think that, you know, but in any case, we have our very first interview tonight with a cantorial candidate, just the small committee to see. We have two interviews this week, and then a decision will be made whether either of these candidates should come in front of the entire committee. So we'll see. On paper, they're both very viable candidates. I keep saying to Nancy, on paper, they're viable candidates. They could be serial killers. We don't really know. But on paper, they look good on paper. So we'll see.
Are they coming from around here or from out
No,
of town?
one is in California and one is in Virginia. But the person
Interesting.
that's in California grew up in Hyde Park,
Oh.
so he would know what he's getting himself into.
Okay, and he's
So-
still coming for an interview.
He's still right. This is by phone. I don't
December.
know if he checks the weather, he could say, on second thought, but he hasn't canceled yet. So,
Okay,
so
Yeah,
we'll
okay.
see. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
Stay
Keep us posted. Keep
Good
us
luck.
posted.
posted. All right, everyone.
Thank
Uh,
you.
If I don't see all of you, have a lovely Hanukkah. And, but don't be strangers. Come to synagogue. Yes, Marsha.
Are we meeting next week?
We're not. We're breaking now until Myra should be sending out the dates. I want to say till the second or third week in January. So the
Oh.
faith curriculum was 12 sessions. So we've done the first 6. We've got 6 more. So we're going to do the 6, I think, like mid-January to February, and then we'll kind of see where we are after that.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
all right,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.